What is up, guys? The Casey's here, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about UI tests. So to get started, I want to talk about a few of the benefits of UI testing. And one that I'd say is pretty valuable is the accessibility that UI testing brings to your app. If you don't know what accessibility is, Apple's created this thing so people that have a disability or an impairment can use devices a lot more easily, and so those people can have a more fun and interactive time with your app. One other thing that the UI test can help with is regressive bugs. Those are bugs that you thought you fixed, but they come back. You can write a UI test to then catch the regressive bug before it comes back, or before you deploy another build. It'll catch that regressive bug so that you can fix it and stop that bug from coming up again. Another thing is just all around better app quality. When you're writing UI tests, you'll find things that you wouldn't have found just by hands-on testing on your device. Some things that the UI test can do will just bring a spotlight to those issues, or maybe even while you're creating the UI test, you'll just notice something you never did before. So those are just like a few of the good reasons to get started with UI testing, and I'm sure there's way more, but those are the ones I've mainly focused on, and hopefully that those few things will get you into the world of UI testing. Some of the tips on getting started is just start. You know, I started UI testing, I knew nothing about it. I didn't even know what a UI test was. I didn't know what XC test was. I didn't know anything. I didn't even understand the concept of UI testing. But if you just get in there, start coding, start reading tutorials, watching some videos, you'll figure it all out. The next thing is I would suggest understanding your app's default state. When you're creating UI tests, it can become very difficult if you're pulling data from the internet. It can become difficult to query the elements because the data is constantly changing. So understand your default state of your app, so then you can better create UI tests for that state. Another thing is, if the UI test seems complicated, it probably is. UI testing is very simple, and if you are doing something that's really complex, it might be complex, but usually, with my experience, it's just you're going at it from the wrong angle. So maybe rethink how you can simplify the test, and you should be able to get it done very simply. Another thing that UI test brings, like I said, accessibility. If there's an element that should be accessible to a user that is using accessibility, the UI test brings light to that, so then you need to make those elements accessible. Many times you can create a custom element in your app or something, and if it's not accessible, then an accessibility user can't use it, but your UI test will have a hard time reading that element on iPad, iPhone. There's also different ways you can query the same element, which we'll get into more. But if you are having trouble querying an element one way, just wait a little bit and think of different ways that you can query that same element, which we'll get into, of course. But yeah, you can query the same element different ways. So don't just think you have to query it one way. Just be open to that. There's multiple ways to query the same element. And I'm not talking like app.buttons with the accessibility label. I mean, like if it's in a table view or something like that, there's usually different ways you can query the same element. Some new terms I wanted to talk about were XUI application, and that's basically the app. So when you're querying elements, you use XUI application to then go off into the query of the app's current state, and XUI application is the base. Apple says it's a proxy for an application that can be launched and terminated. So different tests, you can launch your app, XUI application, you can relaunch it, things like that, but the XUI application is your app, basically. Another term is XUI query, and this is how you query the location for a UI element on the device. We'll get more into that, but the last new term I want to talk about was XUI element. And an XUI element is a UI element in an application. For instance, a button, an image, a tab bar, a navigation bar, things like that. Those are XUI elements, and you can interact with these elements, and you can use the queries to find these elements, which we'll get more into later on. So I want to show you guys this setup. This is basically how we set up UI tests. This is my example project. I'll leave a link below to the GitHub page But this, you'll see here in the pineapple or not UI test, we created a variable called app. An app is a type XUI application, which is what I was talking about, that's the app. And in our setup function, we will set the app to our current instance of XUI application, and then we will launch the app by calling app.launch. The variable continue after failure equals false. That's basically if your test fails, do you want to continue down with your test, or do you want, when your test fails, to just count as a failure and not continue? This comes into a very good place when future things in your function aren't dependent on what just failed. Then continue after failure is completely okay to set to true. Another thing I want to talk to you guys about, when I mentioned the app's default state, this cool thing app.launch arguments, you can set these arguments in here, and then you can call these arguments in your app, so you could change the state of the app based off these arguments you pass when you launch the app in your UI test. And in this example, I passed UI test, offline, and low storage. So maybe if you wanted to change your app when there's low storage only for your UI tests, or you wanted to test something with low storage, you want to test something with offline on your UI tests, this is a great place to pass it in. It's sometimes hard to test your device offline, but if you wanted to create a special suite of tests that were for offline, you could pass in this launch argument, and then now those tests can be run as if the app is offline. So that's one benefit, and something I definitely wanted to show you guys. Another thing that I want to show you guys is how do you create an element. So right here we have a few variables that I created. The knob button is an XUI element. It is of type button. So when I initialize it here, I return app.buttons with the identifier of knob. I'll show you guys in the next video where the knob part comes from, but because of Apple's accessibility, the knob is just the name I have on the label. So it's nothing big that you have to do, but if you're doing custom elements or things like that, you might have to set an identifier so that the test can query that element. Same thing with the pineapple. I just set the button's name to pineapple, and it automatically knows that that's the button, so it can query it easily. When I moved down to the image views, the non-image view and the pineapple image view, I actually had to set an identifier on these images because otherwise it wouldn't be accessible. It was just a random string and it wasn't really easy to test. So I had to set an identifier. Not-image was the identifier I set on the not-image view, and I put pineapple image on the pineapple image view. And you can see we're querying this element with app.other elements.containing of type image with the identifier of not-image. And then we have the dot element because we want to grab the element from that query. The app.other elements containing is a query, and then dot element grabs the element and puts it into the XUI element. And then a couple other things we have is the restart button, just a button with the identifier of restart, and the game over label is a static text because it's a level with game over as the text. So these are just kind of ways that you can initialize variables, and you can use these variables throughout your test. You don't have to initialize them like this, but I think it's an easy way to view these elements, and you can use them in different parts of your tests if you needed to. Let's go on to different ways we can check elements and see or like get different interactions with the elements. So many places you want to see if an element exists. So if we call the element.exists, it will return a true or false if the element exists. This is great when maybe you have like an alert that pops up when the user's offline or something like that. You can make sure it exists, or if you moved to a new view, you can check to see whether something exists. That's a great place to use that. Another one is hittable. This is great when there's possibly an element that's hidden behind something else or it's off the screen. Is hittable, checks, can the user actually tap on this? Is this element hittable or tappable if you were to change the language? But this is also for Mac and iOS, Mac OS and iOS. So they can't just say is tappable because hittable, clickable, so it is hittable. The next one is wait for existence. And this is a really good thing to use. Maybe you have like animations going on in your app. You have a request to the server. It takes time. So if you say .exist and you create some logic off of that, it means exactly right now is this on the view. If you have wait for existence, it gives you a little timeout, and you can make that as long as you want. And if the element exists within that timeout, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. So if you're waiting for something, I would use the wait for existence, and that will better serve you, so it's not just crashing because it doesn't exist immediately. And then the last one is tap. If you're tapping on an XUI element, it just, as if you were tapping on the device. So you can tap a navigation bar, tap the done button, tap the play button, and it creates that action. And there's also a double tap, but also a cool thing about tap, if an element doesn't exist and you tap on it, or it's not hittable and you tap on it, it fails the test. So that's another way you can check to see if elements exist. With pretty much all of those, I would warn you about is hittable. If an element doesn't exist and you call it is hittable, it's gonna fail your test as well. So here's an example of a test that I created. This is a test the game actually works. And I just created a for loop so this thing ran a couple times. I know you guys can't see my app right now. I'll be doing this in another video while I get hands-on. I'll be showing you guys all the different tests and things like that. Right now I'm just recording this video. I'm doing a presentation on Thursday at a meetup, and I just wanted to get this out of the way, give it to you guys, record it, kind of do a little bit of practice for my presentation. But yeah, so next week I'll be recording the video, showing you guys a little bit more in depth on the UITest. But here I just created a for loop, and we're gonna run this for loop 20 times, and we're gonna see if the pineapple image exists, and if it does, we're gonna tap the pineapple button. If it doesn't, we're gonna tap the not button. So basically in the app, if the pineapple exists, you tap the pineapple button, and if the image isn't a pineapple, you tap not. It's called pineapple or not. Just a really simple game that you could use for UITests. And I hope you can see that what this is doing. Maybe it doesn't make sense, and in the next video it will clear everything up. And then at the end, we're asserting that the game over label exists equals false. We don't want the game over label to appear when the game shouldn't be over. So if there's a pineapple image and you tap the pineapple button, it's not game over, so we don't want to see the game over label. If that were to happen and the game over label were to appear, then we have something mess up in our code, and this is why we use UITests. So we can then dive in, why wasn't this working? We can run the test again and then get a better glimpse at what's going on. The assert function, that's just making sure that this has happened. Assert's kind of a more, I don't know if you call it advanced, but it's XC test, and they have assert false, assert true, and I'll go in more depth on that stuff. If you guys have questions about it, leave a comment below. I can help you guys out with that for sure. And if you want, you can also just Google it. I'm sure there's some better tutorials out there just to understand that stuff. And then a little code part, so I can show you guys a lot about how do I create these tests. Like, I understand what a UI test is now, but let me show you guys how to implement it. You know, you don't want to just know what a UI test is. You want to know how do I create a UI test, what's the importance of it. So in the next video, I'll show you guys that with my app, Pineapple or Not. It will be on GitHub. I think it's already there on GitHub. And so if you guys want to download that, you can mess around with it. But next week, I'll be showing you guys a little bit more in depth. But some next steps that you guys can go into with UITests is Firebase Test Labs. They have just released a beta where you can now continuously integrate your UI tests with Firebase, which is really cool. Push a build or whatever, it's just continuously testing your app to make sure that there's no bugs for the tests you've created. Another thing is Fastlane. They have some really cool packages that you can install and run for testing. I would definitely suggest checking that out. An Xcode build server, that would be another way for continuous integration. Test attachments, that's a really cool thing that you can use. You can almost like take a screenshot of your device, so you can send that off in your test if you want to check what the screenshot looks like. Maybe you want to take that screenshot and put it into your images for your App Store images. That's another thing you could do. and a great use, I guess, of the test attachments. And then my final suggestion is just get creative. UITest, it's code, and you can do so many different things with it because you're not limited with code. And I would just suggest get creative. If you are having something you want to test, think of ways that you might be able to do that, because I guarantee there's some way that you can test that with XCTest. So thank you guys for watching the video. If you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. If you have questions, I know UITest is very complicated, so drop a comment below. I will definitely answer those questions. Check out Apple's documentation. They definitely go in depth there. There's not a ton of UITest tutorials out there on the web, but there are some little tutorials here and there, and if you add them all up, you get a good understanding. I just suggest dive in, start creating tests. If it doesn't make sense, figure out why it doesn't make sense. Drop a comment below. I can help you all out with that. But thank you guys for your support. I'm sorry I didn't post last week. I did record the video. It was just horrible. But I'll see you guys next week. Peace out.